a stench so foul it drove servants from the room. His body was covered in ulcers. They burst with pus. His legs, blackened with putrefaction, crawling with maggots. The reeking air seeped through stone walls and lingered in corridors that had once echoed with royal ceremonies. This wasn't the corpse of a forgotten beggar rotting in some ditch. This was the most powerful monarch in Europe, ruler of an empire where the sun never set, master of gold from the Americas, commander of the largest navy the world had ever seen. The world bowed to him, but his body did not. Today, we reveal the horrible death of Philip II of Spain, a king who ruled the world but couldn't rule his own decomposing flesh. Philip II was born on May 21st, 1527, heir to the mightiest dynasty in European history. His father, Charles V, ruled over territories so vast that governing them required a small army of secretaries working around the clock. When Charles abdicated in 1556, overwhelmed by the impossible task of ruling half the known world, Philip inherited an empire that spanned continents: Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, vast territories in Italy, the Americas stretching from Mexico to Peru, and the Philippines named in his honor. At 29, he stood as the most powerful man on earth. Contemporary portraits show him at his peak, tall for his time at nearly 6 feet, pale as ivory, with the distinctive Habsburg jaw and piercing blue eyes that seemed to weigh the souls of men. He dressed always in black silk and velvet, a walking embodiment of Spanish dignity and Catholic piety. Foreign ambassadors noted his habit of standing motionless during audiences, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed and unblinking. They called him His Most Catholic Majesty, not just a king, but God's soldier on earth, defender of the true faith against Protestant heretics and Ottoman infidels. His greatest project reflected his dual nature: the Escorial, a palace and monastery combined into one massive structure of granite and marble. 21 years in construction, it housed 2,673 windows, 1,200 doors, and 40 staircases. Part royal residence, part religious retreat, it contained throne rooms where ambassadors knelt before the king, and crypts where Spanish monarchs lay in eternal rest. Philip ruled from its chambers, signing documents that sent fleets across oceans and armies across continents, always with a crucifix within reach and the scent of incense in the air. The building was his monument to earthly power and divine devotion, and it would become his tomb. So how did this king of kings, this master of half the known world, end up putrefying alive inside the very palace he built? Philip's rise to absolute power came through calculated ambition disguised as divine duty. He centralized control over his vast territories, ruling through an army of bureaucrats who reported directly to him. No decision was too small for the king's attention. He personally reviewed grain shipments to the Netherlands, approved military appointments in Mexico. His courtiers called it devotion to duty. His enemies called it obsession. He saw himself as the sword arm of God, chosen to defend Catholicism against the Protestant rebellion tearing Europe apart. When the Dutch revolted, he sent armies to drown their cities in blood. When Elizabeth I of England supported Protestant rebels, he assembled the Spanish Armada. 130 ships, 30,000 men. A crusade to restore Catholic rule to the British Isles. When Ottoman fleets threatened Christian shipping, his navy smashed them at Lepanto. Victory after victory seemed to prove that God blessed his reign. But beneath the crown, Philip's body had always betrayed him. Even as a young prince, he suffered from violent migraines that left him bedridden for days, his chambers darkened, servants walking on tiptoe. Court physicians noted frequent fever attacks that struck without warning, leaving him shivering beneath heavy blankets, even in summer heat. By his 30s, the early signs of gout appeared. Swollen joints that made walking painful, especially in his feet and hands. His personal valet recorded that the prince often soaked his feet in warm water infused with herbs, grimacing as he tried to flex his toes. the symptoms worsened as his responsibilities grew. During the early years of his reign, Philip would sometimes disappear from court for weeks, officially said to be on hunting trips or religious retreats. In reality, he was confined to his private apartments, wrestling with bouts of illness that left him weak and disoriented. His royal physicians kept detailed notes describing episodes where the king would vomit repeatedly, complaining of stabbing pains in his abdomen that left him doubled over and gasping. Around 1590, when Philip was in his 60s, the first truly alarming signs appeared. Open sores appeared on his hands. They wept clear fluid. It smelled of copper and salt. The royal physicians applied poultices of herbs and mercury, but the wounds refused to heal. Instead, they spread, appearing on his torso and legs like a slow plague, consuming him from within. The Spanish ambassador to Rome, writing to his brother in 1594, described a disturbing audience with the king. His Majesty received me in his private study, but I was struck by a most disagreeable odor that seemed to emanate from his person. He scratched constantly at his arms beneath his sleeves, and when he reached for documents, I glimpsed dark stains upon his shirt cuffs. The king appeared unaware of these afflictions, speaking normally of state matters, yet I confess I found it difficult to concentrate on his words. Even his own stench drowned out his power. By 1595, the physical changes were impossible to hide. Philip, once known for his ramrod posture and measured gait, began walking with a pronounced limp. His left leg had swollen noticeably, forcing him to lean heavily on a walking stick carved from ebony and inlaid with silver. Court tailors had to constantly alter his clothing as his body shape changed, his torso thickening while his limbs grew thin and wasted. The black silk doublets he favoured now hung loose in some places while stretching tight across his expanding midsection. Court records from this period describe a king increasingly confined to his private chambers, though still insisting on reviewing every document that required his signature. Servants noted that his clothes often bore dark stains, and the smell of medicines and something else, something fetid, began to cling to the rooms where he worked. Philip himself seemed unaware of the stench, or perhaps he had grown accustomed to it. He continued to fast for religious holidays, pray for hours in his private chapel, and dictate letters to governors across his empire. But those closest to him whispered that something fundamental had changed. The king, who had once stood for hours reviewing troops, now needed help rising from his chair. The hands that had signed death warrants and peace treaties trembled when he reached for his pen. And sometimes, in the middle of dictating a letter about taxes or troop movements, he would stop mid-sentence, staring at nothing, as if his mind had traveled to some place his courtiers could not follow. But what terrified his inner circle most were the moments when Philip seemed to forget where he was entirely. The Duke of Lerma, his chief minister, wrote privately to his son, "Yesterday, His Majesty summoned me to discuss the defense of Flanders, but when I arrived, I found him speaking animatedly to the empty chair where his father the Emperor used to sit. He gestured as if receiving counsel, nodding and responding to unheard words. When I cleared my throat, he looked at me with such confusion, as if I were the phantom in the room. The King of the World spoke to ghosts. The turning point came in the summer of 1598. Philip II, now 71, and bearing the accumulated weight of 4 decades of absolute rule, retreated to his beloved Escorial for what would become his final imprisonment. What began as a temporary withdrawal from public duties became a 52-day death watch. A death watch that would horrify even the most hardened courtiers. The king's condition deteriorated with shocking speed. The open sores that had plagued him for years burst into full ulceration, covering his body from chest to feet. His legs swelled grotesquely. The skin split open, yellow fluid poured out. It soaked through the bed. The royal physicians, desperate to contain the damage, ordered a special bed constructed with leather straps to hold the king in place as his body leaked and festered around him. The pestilential smell became unbearable. Servants assigned to the king's chambers began fainting from the smell of gangrenous flesh mixed with the medicinal oils and perfumes used to mask it. Windows were thrown open even during cold nights, but nothing could clear the air. Courtiers making their required visits to pay respects would cover their faces with scented handkerchiefs and flee as quickly as protocol allowed. Father Diego de Yepes, Philip's confessor, wrote in his private journal, "I must steel myself each morning before entering His Majesty's chamber. The foul odor strikes like a physical blow, so powerful it penetrates even the thick walls of this holy place. Today I found the king propped against pillows dark with stains I dare not describe. Yet he insisted on confessing his sins in full detail, as if the corruption of his body had freed his mind to examine every transgression of his reign. He spoke for nearly an hour of the souls lost in the Netherlands, asking repeatedly if God could forgive a king who had ordered so much bloodshed in his name. Even God's soldier questioned his wars. Yet perhaps most disturbing was what lived in Philip's wounds. Palace records, written in the careful language of men afraid to speak too plainly about their sovereign, note that the ulcers showed signs of movement and required daily cleaning to remove foreign matter. The foreign matter was maggots. The king's own flesh had become a breeding ground for insects that crawled in and out of his body while he remained conscious and alert. The daily routine of caring for the king became a nightmare for his servants. Each morning, his personal attendants would arrive armed with bowls of wine, clean linens, and herbal preparations designed to mask the smell. They would carefully unwrap the bandages from his wounds, revealing the full extent of the corruption beneath. The process took nearly 2 hours, during which Philip would grip the arms of his chair and recite prayers under his breath, sometimes loud enough for the servants to hear him asking God for forgiveness for sins they could not name. Despite this nightmarish corruption, Philip II continued to govern his empire from his deathbed. He insisted that dispatches from the Americas be brought to his chamber, reports from military commanders, requests for royal approval. Secretaries would hold documents at arm's length, while the king, propped up on pillows soaked with pus and blood, would dictate responses or scratch his signature with a trembling hand. The man who had micromanaged the largest empire in human history could not, would not, delegate authority, not even as his body dissolved around him. Even his most trusted advisors began to struggle with the reality of serving a dying king. The Marquis of Denier, Philip's closest confidant, wrote to his wife, "I fear I am losing my mind along with my sovereign. Each day I must enter that chamber of horrors, pretending that the man giving me orders is still the mighty king who once terrified all of Europe. But how can I respect commands given by a creature who barely resembles a human being?" Yet still, his mind remains sharp, his memory perfect for every detail of state business. It is as if God is testing our loyalty by trapping a king's soul inside a corpse. His mental state remained remarkably intact, though increasingly focused on religious matters. He spent hours clutching crucifixes and religious relics, whispering prayers in Latin and Spanish. Sometimes the fever would take him, and he would speak to people who weren't there. His dead father, Charles V, his beloved third wife, Isabella, saints whose names only he could hear. But when the fever broke, he would immediately ask for the latest news from his territories, his mind snapping back to the business of ruling as if death were merely another administrative problem to be solved through careful attention to detail. Yet, in his lucid moments, a different Philip emerged. One consumed not by governance, but by guilt. His personal secretary, Mateo Vasquez, recorded a chilling conversation from August 1598. "His Majesty called me to his bedside in the deep of night, his face ghostly pale in the candlelight. He gripped my arm with surprising strength and whispered, 'Mateo, I have been calculating. Do you know how many souls I have sent to judgment in my wars? How many mothers have cursed my name as they buried their sons?' When I tried to reassure him that his wars were just, fought for God's glory, he shook his head violently. God's glory, or Philip's pride, I can no longer tell the difference. He released me then and turned his face to the wall. weeping silently until dawn. The conqueror of nations wept for his victims. By September 1598, even Philip II could no longer deny what his courtiers had whispered for months. The king was dying. His condition entered its final, most gruesome phase. The fever that had come and gone for weeks now burned constantly. His breathing became labored, each breath a struggle against the fluid filling his lungs. The ulcers on his body had merged into vast patches of blackened, mortifying flesh. On September 10th, Philip received the last sacraments of the Catholic Church. The ceremony that should have brought him peace instead became another horror. Father Hieronimo de Florencia, the priest performing the ritual, had to pause repeatedly, overcome by the smell rising from the royal deathbed. Holy water applied to Philip's forehead mixed with the pus seeping from sores on his scalp. The communion bread, placed on his swollen tongue, had to be forced down with wine because his throat could barely swallow. The Marquis of Denia, who witnessed the ceremony, later wrote, "I have seen many men die, but never have I witnessed such a mockery of human dignity." His Majesty's body had become a landscape of corruption. His face so swollen that his eyes appeared as mere slits, his lips cracked and bleeding, his breath coming in horrible gasps that filled the chamber with the smell of internal putrefaction. Yet through it all, he maintained his composure, responding to the priest's Latin with perfect pronunciation, as if his soul had somehow remained untouched by the destruction of his flesh. For 3 more days, Philip clung to life with the same stubborn will that had built his empire. He held religious relics against his chest, fragments of the true cross, bones of saints, medals blessed by the Pope. His voice, now barely a whisper, continued to murmur prayers in Latin. Courtiers reported that he seemed most peaceful when holding a small wooden crucifix that had belonged to his father, Emperor Charles V. But even in these final hours, the king's mind remained focused on earthly concerns. On September 12th, less than 24 hours before his death, Philip summoned his secretary one final time. In a voice so weak that the man had to lean directly over the putrefying royal body to hear, Philip dictated his final orders: instructions for the defense of Spanish territories in Italy, provisions for the payment of soldiers' wages in Flanders, and detailed arrangements for the succession of his son Philip III. The smell was so overwhelming that attendants struggled to remain in the room as he dictated his final orders. But the king continued speaking as if nothing had happened. On September 13th, 1598, at dawn, Philip II of Spain took his final breath. He died as he had lived, surrounded by symbols of power and faith, but utterly alone in his suffering. The moment of death brought no dignity. His body was swollen with putrefaction until the body gave way, a final flood of fluids. It soaked the bed. It spread across the floor of his chamber in the Escorial. The immediate aftermath revealed the full horror of what the most powerful monarch in Europe had become. Philip's corpse was so bloated and rigid that moving it required multiple servants. The combination of decomposition and the leather straps used to restrain him during his illness had left deep marks across his torso. Palace workers tried desperately to prepare the body for viewing, applying layers of perfumed oils and wrapping the worst ulcers in silk bandages. But nothing could disguise what 4 decades of absolute power had cost him. Even in death, the putrid stench persisted. The chamber where Philip II had ruled his empire and met his end had to be sealed and would not be used again for months. The smell of his putrefaction had soaked into the very stones of the Escorial, the monument he had built to celebrate the glory of God and the power of Spanish kings. Philip II was buried in the royal crypt beneath the Escorial, the palace monastery that had been both the seat of his power and the scene of his destruction. The funeral was conducted with all the ceremony due to the most Catholic king in Europe, but no amount of ritual could erase the memory of his final weeks. The man who had commanded fleets and armies, who had held the fate of millions in his hands, had died as helplessly as any peasant consumed by disease and time. The irony was complete and cruel. Philip had built the Escorial as a monument to divine authority and royal power, a place where earth touched heaven and kings communed with God. Instead, it became his tomb while he still lived, the place where the master of the world's greatest empire rotted alive in full view of his courtiers and servants. His vast dominion, which he had defended with fanatical devotion, began crumbling almost immediately after his death. The treasure fleets from America could no longer finance endless wars. The Spanish Armada, rebuilt after its defeat by England, proved unable to maintain control over rebellious territories. The Netherlands, which Philip had tried to reconquer through decades of brutal warfare, slipped permanently from Spanish control. The empire that had stretched across 4 continents contracted like a dying body, losing piece after piece of its former greatness. Philip II ruled the largest empire of his time. More wealth, more territory, more armies than any monarch in history. But in the end, he met the same fate as every man, consumed by corruption, pain, and the inexorable deterioration of mortal flesh. His death reminds us that no empire, no matter how vast, can protect its ruler from the betrayal of the body. The king who claimed to rule by divine right discovered that divine will included maggots, putrefaction, and the democracy of death that makes beggars of us all.